Okay, good morning. Please put your phones on silent so you don't interrupt our speakers, if you wouldn't mind. Which point, of course, I always remember I haven't actually done my own. Quick agenda for the day. Yes, we're already running late, so I hope you enjoyed your dinner yesterday evening. There were still a lot of you in the bar when I went to bed, and that was quite late, so I know that some of you did. Session 1 today, then a coffee break. Session 2, then lunch. After lunch, the final session, and we finish at 4 o'clock. That's the plan for the day. So session 1, we have, firstly we have Wolfgang Goebel, our president, who will make his introductory presentation. Then we welcome a new face to ECG, Stephen Van Arsdale from Autofacts at PwC. So we're very pleased to have him with us. Another new face today, Dario Dubolino from DG Move. So welcome, Dario. Thank you for joining us. And then finally, and this is where it gets a little bit experimental, because Martin Corner in the end wasn't able to join us in person, so he'll be joining us online from Gothenburg. And I have complete faith in our audiovisual colleagues at the back of the room to make that happen. So with no further ado, I will hand over once again to Wolfgang.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the room with a bit different setting than yesterday, but the good thing is everybody is fitting this morning in this room. I think, Mike, you did not mention we have the first time a hybrid conference. I don't know actually how many people have dialed in, but we have you have recognized this. We have sent out from early this week invitation, as the conference is sold out, to join us online here. So again, on behalf of our board, of our Vice President, Björn Svenningsen, welcome to this conference, the first one, as we already said yesterday, after 2 years. Thanks to our sponsors for being very loyal also in these difficult times, for joining us again. Mike told me yesterday we have a record attendance of sponsors also. I said yesterday evening when we discussed a bit about the difficulties in the industry, let's stay optimistic, let's stay in a positive way. And I would also like to start today with the positive outlook. The decarbonization of our sector is a positive outlook. When we see what's happening in the world and around, I think we have to make our contribution to get the global warming down to a level which will be bearable for next generation. So therefore, we have set the theme of this conference. We have invited the Commission. Dario is here. We had just a short chat a couple of minutes ago, and we are very keen to learn and to hear what Fit for 55 means for the finished vehicle logistic. First, after my speech, there will be PwC Autofacts. I think most of you remember Christoph Stürmer. He was here yesterday evening as well, but now we have the successor, and we look forward to hopefully at least some sun in the end of the horizon. No? The decarbonization of our industry and of the entire industry, traffic, everything is supposed to be the biggest challenge we are facing in this decade. And all what we have learned also looking at the election which took place in Europe in the last couple of years and this year in Germany, we think that also the citizens of Europe recognize this. They are voting in this direction, and this is something which we have actively to support. So all our program today is around this. It's around use cases. We have a vessel operator, we have a rail operator, we have some interesting innovation coming from compound robotics, if I may call it like that. So means moving around the cars without having, at least till now, the combustion engine running. And of course, most important for us, the expectation of our clients. So we will hear today from Toyota and from Daimler what they expect from our industry to be ready for this new phase. All these requirements and let me say new legislation will force us to invest in new technology. For our industry being already in the second bad year, I call 2021 already a bad year when I look at our own balance sheet. I think we have to be aware that the willingness and the ability to invest of the industry will be limited. If the outlook remains as it is for 22, I think it will be even more severe. So one presentation in the session 3 will be around funding and European and national funding opportunities for all of you to get these investments supported. I'm sure, if this is working, I'm sure that you have followed our business intelligence reports we do together with our friends from Ultima Media. We have started quite early with a report, I think in March. The first one was chipping away at it. The first time when we put, let me say, the focus on the microchip crisis. We continued in June with a second report on material shortages. And I think you're also aware about the other publications about online vehicle sales, Chinese manufacturers and so on coming to Europe. And for the funding program, we made a bit bigger effort. First of all, we had these 2 publications, and we also did a webinar where some of you joined, where our specialist Tom and his colleague presenting also this afternoon explained and gave also replies to questions. So I would urge you to use all these opportunities the European Union and your national governments are offering to you. And we are trying to support you as much as possible in get the right funding for the investment. From my understanding, the most important thing before we invest in new technology is how the carbon emission of our sector, whatever we use, a vessel, a train, a truck, or if we operate a compound, how this is measured. So what will be the future standard and the methodology for the measurement, and also even before we start to measure, we all know we have to win a tender, and all what we have learned is that the OEMs will evaluate in future the at least predicted CO2 emission of every trade line we are offering. So we said this is a very much focus point. When you have looked at the booklet which we gave you yesterday for the conference, on the left side is our roadmap. On the roadmap, you can also see that the future carbon emission standard and methodology is a key item. So what did we do? First of all, with the working group, we discussed with OEMs and LSPs about the requirements. We have to understand the system and the methodology behind. We have a partnership with scientific institutes where we work together. And yesterday evening, I learned that old friend of us, Frank Straube, from the TU Berlin, was the one who invented the ISO norm, the DIN ISO norm for the measurement. So this is very important for us. I connected him with Andrea, and I think we make some jumps here to get better to a standard. We have discussed yesterday with the OEMs that we will release a first draft of our proposal by the end of this year. So I think you all agree with me that if we invest in something where in the end we are not sure that this is matching the requirement and bring us into the right position to not only reduce the emission, but also to be measured and evaluated like that, it doesn't make any sense. So also one of the core tasks of ECG to set standards together with all market players. This might be an open question after Andreas' presentation this afternoon, where this conference will end with, because I hope we come into a bit of discussion with the OEMs, with the Commission, what the opinions are, and then we can go from there. Now I would like to come back to our red banner. which I have highlighted yesterday. I think we don't have to go too much in detail. We will have PwC. I used one of your slides, at least a part of it, sorry for this, but just to give the idea that everything for the moment is really going down. This morning, ACEA has published the latest registration figures for September, I think minus 23% against last year. Last year was a recovery month, but anyways, we are absolutely not on the right track. And as I have said yesterday evening, the reduction is in everything. It's in new cars, it's in used cars, it's affecting all our processes, all our cycles. Therefore, we made, as I also said last night, we made some noise in the press, but the focus of ECG is not the press. The focus is, first of all, to make alert if there is a necessity for this. And on the other hand, of course, we need to talk to the OEMs and we need to focus and show, let me see, at least some ideas which everybody can discuss with the clients. The difference of this crisis, from my understanding, is first of all that it's a very atypical crisis. We have discussed this also yesterday in the industry meeting, and Björn and Konstantino also made some very smart comments on this. The point is that consumer confidence is there. The people are willing to buy the cars, but they cannot be delivered. So it's a question of time, and we will see how long it takes until we overcome all this material. It's not only semiconductor shortages. We have discussed yesterday afternoon with our OEMs, we have discussed 5 different points. We call this the 5 action points. First of all, I think that's not something new. We need a forecast and we need to be informed on time if a factory is closing, if anything is changing in the foreseen schedule. We have, as ECG, we have set up Project CESAR as one of our tools from the toolbox of efficiency. I don't know if you use it. We use it in our company. It's still working, but the best tool, of course, is not helpful if there is no real input, and we need this input. Yesterday, one of the OEMs said very clear, we are focused to inform the right partner at the very right moment. So I have confidence also that best practice in this forecasting, which is evident for us, will continue. And everybody should really go to his clients and force them to give us as much data as possible. The second thing is adjustment of KPIs, of service level agreements. We think that with volumes which have dropped 30%, 40%, sometimes even more, we cannot give the same service level. We have to make a red line, which we are not crossing in terms of frequencies and so on. But in the end, we need to use this as a tool for efficiency. The other thing, we cannot stop a vessel in the middle of the sea on a Wednesday. We cannot stop a train or even a long distance truck, but we can, for compound operation, we can reduce and we can shrink the time. We are working, for example, to 4 days, which gives more efficiency than having 5 days, 80% use of compounds and of labor there. We have tried this and we are starting to try this in some of our compounds, and it's working. We proposed this to some of our biggest clients, and I can also tell you that the reaction was not negative in the first instance. Of course, you have to agree on something which is reasonable, which is then not getting problem into sales and into the dealerships, but I think this is something which is absolutely realistic. Respect the payment terms should be normally going without saying, but we all know that this is sometimes quite difficult. Cash is king, especially in the crisis. So we all have to take care for this and respect these terms. And then to summarize, I think we are all sitting in the same boat. Somebody said yesterday, if the volumes are coming back, hopefully 22 or early 23, and the capacity is reduced, we are facing will face difficulties in a complete a different situation from today, and everybody has to do the job now to get to this point. My overall conclusion is, because we always have to be positive, let's stay positive and optimistic. As I said, the consumer confidence is there, the economic growth in most of the markets is there, also inflation and growing energy prices. But anyways, we see a lot of new product coming to the market, especially with the new drivetrain. Electric cars are subsidized still. We see the first electric trucks coming. We have electric vans. So everything is in process. I think the community and the customers are ready to accept and to buy. There's just this little problem with the supply. To close, maybe my personal experience, our industry is strong. It's a surviving industry. It's an industry which is ready to fight. People are not leaving the marketplace in the first moment, but there's a limit for everyone. And I would really like to urge you to spread this news. When you talk to OEMs, there's a limit for everything, which we have to do. We have to get out of this situation together, and we have to balance it more. I said yesterday evening, from my understanding, this is it's an unbalanced crisis. When we look at the previous crises, they have all been affecting the whole industry, all the market players, sometimes even like the lockdowns, the whole economy. Now it's quite unbalanced, and let's work on the balance. I think that's my credo for the next days and week. I would like to thank you for joining. I would like to invite you to read the book of Bill Gates. We have done this as an electronic version, also to save wood and to save paper. So I think there's a clear, there's a scan in your booklet you can download, and you can read the Bill Gates book. Thank you very much, and have a good conference.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Yeah, just to be clear on the book, it's if you scan the QR code, basically you can select on our little survey what language you want, and then we'll order it and get it sent to you in the coming days. So with our compliments. So next up, I would like to introduce from PwC Autofacts, Stephen, welcome. The floor is yours.
See, everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Very good. All right, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. Yeah, I'd like to take you through a bit of a market update on where we see things headed. All right, so just very briefly about PwC. I'm guessing most of you have heard of PricewaterhouseCoopers before, one of the big four, our Brussels office just down the street. But yeah, we're active all over the world in 157 different countries, 742 different locations with something like 276,000 employees, including support. And we're unique in that we also have our strategy and strategic consulting, as well as advisory, and Autofacts is a part within this. We're focused a lot on internal things. We're doing a lot of supporting a lot of other teams on projects, and involved in other external events as well. All right, so just very briefly, the agenda today. So I'll just take you through the current kind of forecast and market drivers that we see, a bit of a sales and production update, and finally the recovery paths we see in the upcoming years. All right, so first, just a little bit of economics data. So we have here the real GDP and economic sentiment indicator. So we know the markets have, of course, recovered from the lows of 2020, but we'll see in some cases now in 2021, it's still a bit sluggish. And when we look compared to 2019, we have a lot of times 2019 as a base year, of course, how things were before COVID. And we can see in some cases, especially in sales, for example, where we're still at or below, certainly below 2019 numbers still. So we look here at the real GDP, we see the top bar of red in each of these, the top five, the EU top 5 markets. The 2019 numbers, they were between essentially just above 0 and 2%. Then the yellow, the 2020, where we had significant declines of upwards of 10%. And this year, of course, we've had, due to the vaccinations and opening up of things, of course, we've had some significant increases, but we haven't recovered all of last year. And then when we look at the economic sentiment indicator, we can see, of course, in March 2020, that significant decline. And that's been, we've all seen this nice pickup we've had since then, same thing. I mean, the stock market would follow a similar line as this. But then we can see here, when we look towards the very end, around the September period, the latest data that we have, we can see where we've lost a lot. That steam has kind of dried out, and in some cases, we're actually declining a little bit. And I think people are witnessing that, you're experiencing that now with a range of different things. That's coming a lot down to this supply chain issues that we're having, and just that people are having trouble getting what they need. We're having inflation picking up, all of these that are triggering some of that. And I mean, consumer inflation has hit its highest level for over a decade, and ECB is easing its pace of purchasing. So all these things at play here from an economic point of view. And then looking also at key commodity prices. I'm not sure if any of you are very familiar in the US. Before the crisis happened, the previous president had made tariffs on steel in the US, and that was already before COVID-19 having an impact on steel in the US, and was shifting companies in the US towards buying US-based steel, and they were building up the steel industry a bit in the US that had been on a decline. So in some cases, that was actually a bit of luck that the US was then better prepared with some of their own steel production. But at the same time, we've seen, because the plants were completely closed for steel and for aluminum in this COVID period, they've picked back up, but of course they can't from one day to the next be fully online. So you have, again, all these supply chain issues in different areas along the process. And we can see it is still forecasting a little bit worse before it gets better as far as pricing, as there's still a supply and demand issue. But in the US is the highest, and it comes, one of the points also is the US opened up earlier than Europe with restrictions. They were a bit less aggressive on closing things down. So similarly, I think in general, a lot of the issues we're seeing in Europe are a bit what happened in the US, but a few months later. For example, the used car prices going up, the lack of inventories that we see, all the inventories in the US completely dry up. And now we're seeing that happening. It's becoming more apparent in Europe, and it's affecting sales that we were seeing a few months ago in the US. All right, I think this is probably what we already saw a preview previously. I think probably one of the more interesting slides to see, where we look at confirmed closures and essentially the number of the vehicles that have essentially been lost, which we can't really regain, and what's then still announced as production losses, essentially. So we can see, what's interesting as well is when we were looking at Q2, and there hadn't really been a lot of announcements yet for Q3, and we thought, okay, again, based on everything that was said in the beginning, it was the thought that we're seeing the worst of it now in Q2. It's not going to really get worse in Q3, or it'll be similar. And then as Q2 was progressing and coming into Q3, there was just kind of one announcement from an OEM after another, and it just kept piling up, and then Q3 ends up being worse. So we again don't think Q4 is going to be as bad. We think we're turning the page on the worst of it, but we can see that Q3 ended up being a lot worse, and that was also due to Toyota, who had previously escaped without a lot of trouble, and they really made up a lot of market share the past year. But they also then had some impacts where they also ran into shortages, because when this drags on so long, eventually, even if you have a stockpile, it's going to run out. And then at the same time, you have someone like Tesla shifting to other chips, which is also quite interesting as a solution. But of course, because they're so vertically integrated, that's something they can do that other automakers can't just simply switch to another chip. And of course, the technology there, it's one thing if your iPhone does a hard reset, but if your car does a hard reset while you're driving down the road, that's a lot bigger issue. Yeah, I think some of the other reasons behind these closures, we had kind of perfect storm. So COVID, the OEMs saying that they didn't need as many chips, so they reduced their orders in a lot of cases. And then when they were coming back online and starting up their plants again, that would have already made it complicated, but we had the fire in Japan, we had bad weather in the US impacting the semiconductor production, and we've had in Asia, of course, is where a lot of the semiconductors are produced, and we've had the kind of additional waves of COVID in some of the countries in Southeast Asia. So all of these things have made a sort of perfect storm, if you will. But yeah, OEMs, I think now are rounding the corner on this. We're seeing optimism into 2022 in the first half and into the second half of 2022. OEMs, as we've seen, have made good profits due to prioritizing vehicles with high margins and skipping models that have lower margins. And at the same time, due to supply and demand, they've just been able to cut their incentives. So for them, it's nice. And they say in the future they want to manage this similarly, but we know that they'll likely continue to increase production when they can, and will fall into our similar paths as in the past. Just another kind of aspect coming into this, impacting a bit the current status, is the ICE bans that we've seen. So we have a bit of a world view with some announcements that have been made, and then we have a more specific European level view. We know Norway has been one of the most aggressive, and that's already in Oslo as of 2024 planned. We have, otherwise it's down mostly to specific city level bans that have been announced. And we know, of course, I think we'll get into that in the next presentation with the Green Deal, what's happening as far as 2035. But this is certainly interesting to see that the timeline is coming quite soon. And at the same time, when we look at some of the OEM plans, their phase outs of pure ICE. We know Smart was one of the first around 2020. DS has announced this. Volvo and Jaguar have been quite aggressive as well, with a whole bunch of other automakers coming around this 2030 time period. And at the latest, of course, around 2035, because that's also when the current proposal is for the ICE to phase out in Europe. So looking a bit at sales here, I've included 2019, 2020, and the forecast through 2021. I think the 2019 is interesting. As I mentioned, this is a bit our base year before COVID came. So when we look at the sales, we can see in some cases, the yellow bar being the 2020 and the red following it being the 2021, that the numbers are in some cases, they're very similar or even below, because the end of 2020, we had some pent-up demand and we had more inventory. So we had a jump on sales that when we look now at this year forecast, in some markets, we're actually expecting to underperform last year due to a range of different reasons. And we can see also the percentage change between 2019 versus 2021. And in some markets like Spain, it's down close to 30% from what 2019 levels were in 2021. So it's still really dragging on. And we're expecting 2022, of course, to start looking better, but it's going to take some time to recover. And based on what we've seen, we don't see the recovery as quick as we had previously expected. So here when we look, this is on a global level at the passenger car vehicle sales, where we see the change. I think what's also interesting, just to kind of get an understanding of where we are in a picture of 2009 through 2021, we can see here the low point in this case was actually in 2009. Of course, that's why we picked this year, the recession that we had. In 2017 was the highest global sales. And we see that where 2020 was and where 2021 is forecast to be, just as a sort of to understand a bit where we are on 1 million units, so still below the 70 million unit number in 2021. The other point here, so we have from our side, 3 scenarios that we do, which are then in a couple of remaining, the last few slides. These are our downside scenario, our base scenario, and our upside scenario. And to say it very basic, so in a few words, the upside scenario is that everything's going very well now and in the coming years with, when it relates to vaccination rates, to the status of COVID variants coming, supply chain issues. The base case is a bit status quo, and then the low case downside scenario is where we see things in the event of, you know, a new Delta variant of COVID, for example, additional issues, and that's where we see then kind of the range depending on how things are progressing, to give you kind of a ballpark, good, average, bad. And we can see then that the results, again, so this 2021 in the base case, something like 68 million units, up to about 69.5, and a downside of around 66 million globally for this year. All right, and then we look at production specifically for Europe. So here again, we can see also the dotted lines which show 2019 and 2020 as basis points. And we can see towards the end of last year, around this time, where actually the 2020 numbers had overtaken 2019 because there was that pent-up demand, and you know, there wasn't really there was still an adequate supply of things. We weren't having as many supply chain issues as we're having this year. So we can see where it actually overtook it. And now when we look at the remainder of this year, we see that we've picked up a bit from the dips around August. I mean, that also has to do in Europe, seasonality-wise, to plants just typically going a bit offline. But we can see the remainder of the year, you know, picking up a little bit, but nothing major happening. On the other hand, we see that chart again with the vehicle production, the range. So we see that actually 2017 was the high year for Europe, and the low was in this 2020-2021 period, the lowest production that we've had in Europe. But yeah, we're seeing that starting to pick up, but still some time to go. Because here now when we look at the medium-term production, specifically for Europe, we've revised this from our last release. We do this monthly, and from last time we had a more aggressive 2022, but now we see this a little bit more relaxed coming back. So when we look up to the 2023 timeline, we can see the green in that upside scenario where it's a little bit better, but in general, we're still having a pretty slow return back. And even in 2023, we're not back to what is the base 2019. The base 2019 is a forecast before anyone knew of COVID, where we kind of saw European production going. And we can see that based on those historic assumptions that we're still in 2023 below where we were previously. And we can see the percentage changes there below as well. And finally, just medium-term sales goals. So this is now on a global level, just to understand, as I mentioned before, something we're in the neighborhood of this 80 million units as a sort of record in the 2017 period. And yeah, we see by 2023 coming pretty close to where we had been, what our assumption had been from 2019 before as a base, but we're still not quite there, and more of that growth is coming from outside of Europe because, as we saw in the previous slide, the Europe is still a bit further below, but we're coming back towards our previous numbers. So. All right, that's everything from my side. If there's any questions, let me know. Also feel free to talk to me later in the break or so.
You see, I told you there wouldn't be any questions. Oh, there's one. Yeah.
I think I can speak loud enough.
Yeah, that's a good. There's a microphone just coming, and then the people online can hear as well. Thanks, Andrea.
First of all, thank you for the interesting presentation. You said one sentence. Very interesting. You said the OEMs now say that, or you said that the volume, when the material and semiconductors are available again, will catch up. So they will increase production again to, I always call this one car more than the market demands. What we have now is one car less.
Yeah.
And we see on transaction prices for new car, for used cars, they are doing better. In contrary, what you have said, the CFO of Daimler and also I think of BMW said a couple of weeks ago in an FT interview that they will maintain with the current level of output, so producing one car less than the market wants. As most of us here in the room made money with this overcapacity in the last years, I'm interested if you really think that it will come back to the old production scheme, or if there's a learning curve.
Well, yeah, I think there's an interesting point. So I think that this is definitely the OEMs getting a bit greedy in the end, and it's competition. So, you know, for example, in the US market, you always have a very tight race between Lexus, Mercedes, and BMW, for example. And this year, Lexus had the capacity, so they've increased their sales, and they're in the first place at the moment. And that's one example where you always see them fighting each other to have the sales crown. And also on global levels, historically, we've always seen the big premium OEMs specifically talk about wanting to be #1 in sales, because of course your costs are then divided out across a greater number. You have the factories there, you have the production available. It's not very easy to close plants, especially for premium European OEMs here. And you know, for their governments, they don't want to see that. It's a difficult message to bring across. So I don't see any reason why they won't try to produce as many cars as they can, because it also comes down to then a way to, be #1 in sales and keep your plants going. So I think they're saying this right now, and they like having the higher margins, but sure.
Any more questions for Stephen? No? Okay, Stephen, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dario De Molina from DG Move, just down the road. Thank you for joining us once again. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's great. It's a first live event I go to since COVID, so it's great. I'll give you a bit of an overview of where we are and where we want to be in 2050 in terms of our decarbonization strategy at the European level, and what this means for the transport sector in general, and your specific sector in particular. So we start with what is the vision to 2050? We set it very clearly in the European Green Deal. By 2050, Europe needs to become carbon neutral. It's not really a choice. It's the result of the scientific data we have that show us that if we want to limit the catastrophic impact of climate change, this is the path to go. We've set a climate target plan setting, in order to get there, emission reductions for the whole economy of 55% by 2030. And what is really important in your context is that transport is the only economic sector that has not reduced its emission in the past couple of decades. And there is no scenario where we meet our climate target and transport as a whole does not reduce its emission by at least 90%. So that is the starting point. We need the transport sector to reduce its emission by 90% by 2050. And as you can very well imagine, this is a challenging proposition. Now, the Green Deal and the target plan give us the overall framework for the economy and society. This is where we need to go. And it tells us transport needs to reduce by 90%. Last year, we produced a sustainable and smart mobility strategy, looking at what does this mean in more detail for the transport sector, again, the whole transport sector for the moment. We've already seen last year. The objective of the strategy is to set the pathway, the milestone, and concrete initiatives to make the European transport system sustainable, smart, and resilient while achieving this 90% emission target reduction by 2050. We have a set of flagship areas and an action plan with, 82 concrete policy actions. Now, I will not go into all the details of the milestone. I assume the slides will be distributed and you'll be able to consult them if you want more information, but somehow you can see this as the pathway we are looking at for the transport sector. So what does it mean concretely? Gradually, with milestones at 2030 and 2050, we see a larger and larger shift in terms of how we transport goods and which modes we use, from road to rail and Waterborne, so towards the modes that have a lower impact overall. We see a gradual electrification, and the role of hydrogen will be growing, but more and more zero-emission vehicles on the road. For road transport is the largest contributor, but it's also the one where we have the technical solutions at hand. We see zero-emission vehicles already on the road. And here we expect, by 2030, we expect 30 million zero-emission cars on the road and 80,000 zero-emission trucks on the road. And by 2050, we expect basically all vehicles on European roads to be zero-emission. And a better integration overall of the different modes, together with, for the moment, a growing share of sustainable fuels in those modes, so waterborne and aviation, where we do not have zero-emission solutions at the moment, but this zero-emission solution coming into play at a later stage, 2035 and onwards, basically. So this is somehow the pathway. What are we putting in place concretely to accelerate this transition? The strategy sets a number of policy actions. I'm mentioning here a few. We are reviewing the CO2 emission performance standard for car and vans. This was published in the Fit for 55 already, together with a revision of the alternative fuel infrastructure, legislation and a roller plant, and ReFuelEU Aviation and FuelEU Maritime for the alternative fuels in these modes. One thing I did not put in this slide, and after Wolfgang's presentation earlier, I think I should have mentioned, is that one of the initiatives we announced is also looking at the certification and declaration of emission for different logistics and passenger choices. So the idea is that we would like to offer the possibility of comparing between different options when you're looking at logistics, freight logistics and passenger transport. This is an initiative in preparation for next year. So I mentioned already the first of these initiatives have already been published as proposals in the Fit for 55 package. This is a rather large and comprehensive package which we published in July this year that contains a set of measures. We call it Fit for 55 with the idea that, as I said, we need to have emission reductions of 55% as a whole by 2030, and this requires action in basically all the sectors of our economy. So the package contains a number of measures covering everything. When it comes to transport specifically, the one you see here at the bottom of the slide, you have CO2 emission standards for car and vans. I mentioned already, in our proposal, we keep the structure that we have with the current CO2 emission performance standards, but we increase the level of ambition. And as Stephen mentioned already, by 2035, we propose a target of 100% reduction. So effectively, by 2035, we would expect all new vehicles to be zero emission when it comes to light-duty vehicles. Alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, of course, you want to put these vehicles on the market, you need to make sure that people driving this vehicle are able to recharge and refuel them across the whole of the EU. And as I was saying earlier, for the modes where we do not have zero emission options at the moment, we need a much greater penetration in the market of sustainable alternative fuels. So the FuelEU Maritime and ReFuelEU Aviation. And then you have the extension of the emission trading scheme to aviation and maritime and to road transport as a separate scheme. Now, I will focus on the measures that I think are probably most relevant here, and also the ones that I'm working on more directly. So specifically, the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation. As I was saying, as a context, we already see a growing share of zero emission vehicles on the market, electric vehicle, battery electric now, hydrogen we expect in a slightly longer term. And we know that a growing share of these will be needed to meet our targets. As I was saying, by 2035, we would expect all new light-duty vehicles to be zero emission, and by 2050, we would expect effectively all road transport vehicles on our road to be zero emission. So we need to adapt our infrastructure to this. And we see this from two main points of view. You can say quantity and quality, if you'd like. So on the one hand, we need to be sure that we have enough recharging points and hydrogen refueling stations, that there isn't too much distance between them, that we really cover the whole network. On the other hand, we need, in terms of quality, full interoperability, also in terms of payments and ease of use. The typical example we hear is you need to download an app to recharge at a given location. You might be in a different country from your own, you don't speak the language, there's instructions on how to download the app to do the payment. We need to get rid of these kind of issues. Now in the proposal, I'll focus now on the quantity aspect. We set mandatory targets for the infrastructure deployment on road. And we set effectively for light-duty vehicles 2 sets of targets. One is what we call fleet-based. So every member state has to ensure that for every vehicle registered in the market, there is a provision of at least, for a battery electric vehicle, at least 1 kilowatt installed power, and for every plug-in hybrid, 0.66 kilowatt. Together with these, also for light-duty vehicles, we have distance-based targets. So on the one hand, we need the overall pool of recharging points to be large enough for the vehicle base. On the other, on the TEN-T network, we need to ensure that there isn't too much distance between the charging point and you have sufficient charging power. For heavy-duty vehicles, this is a different situation because registrations often happen in one country, but then the vehicle is traveling across Europe. So the fleet-based targets for heavy-duty vehicles would not really be needed, but we have strict distance-based target and power target together with specific location target. And for hydrogen, we have also only the distance-based targets, but with numbers that are sufficient to ensure a full coverage. For LNG, we want to ensure that until 2025, we still maintain a full coverage of the network, but we do not put additional obligations because this is seen as a transitional solution, not really for the long term. Looking specifically at heavy-duty vehicles, I mentioned distance-based targets already. So on the TEN-T core network, so on the main highways effectively connecting Europe and the main corridors, our proposal will require to have a charging station every 60 kilometers in each direction, with at least one recharging station of 350 kilowatt by 2025, and a total installed power output of 1400 kilowatt. And by 2030, then this would go up to at least 2 charging stations and 3,500 kilowatt total power output in each station. On the comprehensive network, we keep the same levels of power, but with a larger distance of 100 kilometers and a time frame that is shifting by 5 years, as you can see. In addition to this, we are putting targets for location-based, what we call location-based target. So the first one is on the safe and secure parking area. So what I'm describing here, 350 and over, and actually we would expect this will be 500 kilowatt and 1 megawatt, possibly according to the producers. This is for the fast charging. So your driver is driving 4.5 hours. During the 45 minutes break, they plug in the truck and they recharge for most of its autonomy, or all of its autonomy if it's a larger charger. At the same time, we want to make sure that you have a sufficient coverage at the safe and secure parking so that when the truck is stopping overnight, you can have a slow charging through the night so in the morning the truck is recharged. And recharging stations at urban nodes to help with logistics hubs and similar. Now, of course, one thing that is important is, well, in this kind of situation, a lot of the recharging for electric trucks will happen at the depot, at destination when they're loading and unloading, etc. But this infrastructure is what is required to make sure that at the same time you can also make use of the public infrastructure. Now, for gaseous fuels, so for hydrogen and LNG, and here we have the same targets for both light and heavy-duty vehicles. For hydrogen, we want to cover, again, the TEN-T network with serving with a refueling station every 150 kilometers, hydrogen at 700 bars and minimum 2-ton capacity. And every 450 kilometers, there should be provision also for liquid hydrogen. and again, location-based target in urban nodes. For LNG, basically, what we are asking member states to ensure is that you maintain a good coverage on the network, enough to allow the LNG trucks to circulate through the union whenever there is demand. Again, this is we see this as a transitional solution. We see for LNG the trucks are already on the market. We want to make sure that they can still play their role in the coming years, but we are not planning substantial increases in the infrastructure for them. Now, this is for the infrastructure. I think what we see is taking a bit of a step back in terms of where are we and where are we going when it comes to zero emission trucks. And I think this is quite clear. Stephen mentioned already the commitments from the manufacturers. I've put on this slide some of the references specifically for trucks. I think it's quite clear when you look at ASEA, they expect 40,000 electric trucks on the roads by 2025, 270,000 by 2030, and in addition to that, 60,000 hydrogen trucks by 2030. But we also have the strategies published by the individual producers, and this is quite clear. I mean, each one of them, of course, has slight differences, but when you put them one next to each other, you can see that by 2030, most of them expect between 35 and 60% of their new sales to be battery electric by 2030. So there is a clear plan. If you look at the supply side, there is quite a clear commitment and planning and investment being made by the industry. We also have, looking at the demand, at the supply side, the upcoming revision of the CO2 emission performance standards for trucks in 2022. And here, one thing that is really important to keep in mind, with the current CO2 emission performance standards, so the ones that are already a legal requirement, manufacturers effectively will have to put on the market a certain number of zero emission trucks in order to meet the targets. The targets for 2030 cannot really be met with conventional technologies. And the targets will become more ambitious next year. So from the supply side, I think there is quite a clear perspective. When you look at the demand side, we see more and more operators, and the largest example here would be the European Clean Trucking Alliance, stepping up in terms of their demand for zero emission trucks. And Stephen was mentioning earlier already the so-called diesel bans or restrictions in cities, in other areas. There is a clear push there as well. And for this supply and demand to really become fully operational, what we need is to make sure we have the right infrastructure in place. So that's where the AFIR, the regulation, comes into play, and our financial support as well. Also, very quickly, in terms of the available models of zero emission trucks and buses as well, you can see these from the IEA, the number of models available in the different markets for the moment and based on announcement by manufacturers for up to 2023. And I think one thing to keep in mind when we look at the decarbonization of trucks is that we have a very positive experience that we see with buses in the past years, and we've seen how quickly this can shift, and one can expect that with trucks we will be able to see a similar evolution of the business case and the number of vehicles. Moving to still within the regulation, we also look at waterborne transport, and here we have two sets of provision. One is on the so-called OPS, so the shoreside electricity supply, and the regulation will require all maritime ports on the TEN-T network to provide sufficient installed powers to cover 90% of the demand for all the ships going through. You have all the details in the slide of how this is calculated by 2030. And in inland waterways port, having at least one installation providing shoreside electricity in each one of the ports. On the core network by 2025 and the comprehensive by 2030. For LNG, we require member states to ensure that there is an appropriate number of refueling points, and each member state will designate which ports should be part of this effort to push LNG in maritime. Now, very quickly, the other aspect I will touch upon is the FuelEU Maritime. So an initiative to push the use of alternative fuels in maritime. Where we are right now is that 99% of the fuel used in maritime is fossil fuels. By 2050, we need 90% to be renewable and low carbon fuels in order to meet our target. So it's a complete turnaround. It's of course a massive challenge. Also because unlike road, where we have zero emission solutions ready and on the market, we do not really have this for ships. We do not have a clear one solution. And we need predictability. The lead terms are a lot longer than in road. We have some measures already that we need to complement here on fuel supply, where the Renewable Energy Directive that pushes already the use of renewable fuels. We have the AFIR that I just described, and price signals for DTS. And also because this is a very international sector, of course, we need to make sure that we avoid carbon leakage and guarantee a level playing field. So the proposal sets greenhouse gas intensity limits for the ships that are operating in and from the EU. You can see it sounds relatively slow with 2% and 6%, and then stepping up over time, going up to 75% from 2050. It also have an obligation to use onshore power supply. So you see here in the interaction, in AFIR, we force the ports to provide these, and here we force the ships to use it, and it provides deterrent penalties for those who do not meet these obligations. And overall, this is another very important aspect. Of course, it is consistent with what we're doing internationally at IMO. So this is the picture overall of where we are for the specific initiatives I think are most directly relative to your business. But as you can see, this is part of a much broader transition where we need every part of the economy and of society to play their part. So it is a challenge for everyone, but this is what we're putting in place, and this is the kind of pathway that we see going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Yes, we have got our next speaker online and waiting, but I have one question for you actually, which, looking at that, we have electric trucks, heavy-duty vehicles coming to market, hydrogen fuel cell heavy-duty vehicles coming to market. You've shown us some hugely ambitious targets, but these people cannot buy and operate them unless the infrastructure is there, and for that you're dependent on the member states. How confident is the Commission that the infrastructure will be rolled out fast enough to let those numbers actually happen?
I guess I should.
Yeah.
We are very confident. I think there's different pressures. First of all, I think this is part of the urgency of this is probably the main reason why we are proposing a switch from a directive to a regulation. Now, without going too much into the bureaucratic, but the difference is directive is something where we set the framework and then member states set the direct rules. And this means they need time to adapt the legislation, and we usually have a 2 or 3 years lead time, and it can change from one member state to the other within certain limits. A regulation is directly applicable, and it comes into force as soon as it's adopted. In general, switching from a directive to a regulation is not something you do very easily or lightly. You do some very serious reflection. And we've started discussing with the member states already, and as far as we can tell so far, none of them has been contesting this. They all agree that, yes, a regulation is the right instrument. So that gives you an early sign of, yes, we know that this is urgent, we know that this is important, and we're ready to act for that. But I think beside the legislation, you have a very strong pressure from demand side and supply side there as well. And I think everyone wants this to happen. So we are confident, and we think the level of ambition we have put in place is sufficient to ensure one thing that is important, the regulation set the minimum requirements. We expect these to go a lot higher, but what we need to ensure that is that at the very least, you will have the confidence that everywhere you go in Europe, you will have at least a minimum infrastructure, and then the market will provide the rest.
Very good. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. I've cut the president off. Now I'm in trouble.
Sorry, one question, short question. When will the Commission do a regulation on emission trading for our transport sector?
Well, We do have proposals. I did not go into that because that would take another half an hour at least for that. But in the Fit for 55 package, we do have proposals to extend the ETS to road, and well, to extend the ETS fully to aviation and maritime, and to set up a separate mechanism for road. So now compared to our field that I just described, and I just say this is a, we see that the will is there. For this one, we expect harder discussions and negotiations, so we will see what happens with the co-legislators, but the proposals are on the table. So this is being discussed right now.
Dario, thank you very much indeed. And now with a vision of the future, I hope to welcome Martin Corner, Vice President at Volvo Cars, who should be joining us online from Gothenburg.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear or see me.
I hope.
Hello?
Who was that? Was that Martin?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Ah, excellent. I'm looking at the audience, not at you. Martin, good morning. Thank you for joining us. The floor.
That looks like a horrendously large picture of my head, but okay. Glad I'm not there to see it. Yeah, thank you. And firstly, apologies for not being there. But what I would say is interesting. I realize I haven't worn a suit or a tie for over 2 years since I left Paris. And I'm seeing a room full of suits and ties, which is a shock to the system. But anyway, thank you for hearing me remotely. What I want to share today is a bit of a vision of the journey that Volvo Cars is going on, and talk about the high level implications for vehicle distribution that comes with it, really. So firstly, probably to start with Volvo Cars' journey, I think in the last 10 years, Volvo Cars has already gone through a big change. So if you look back 10 years, Volvo Cars was a 2 European plant, small volume, around 300,000 cars, quite Eurocentric in sales and, let's say, design and culture. And actually, you could argue quite boring cars, very high quality, very safe. And I think we've all seen in the last 10 years, big change in Volvo Cars' position in the market. If you put aside semiconductors, we have an underlying demand of over 800,000 cars now per year, plus. Next year, we're planning to sell over 850,000 cars, semiconductors pending. And we're very firmly now in the premium segment in terms of the margins we're making and the quality of the cars. So that's already been a huge transformation. But in terms of what's coming next, I think Volvo was definitely not first to the party in terms of electric vehicles, but I think our ambitions in terms of transforming from a traditional ICE company to being fully electric by 2030 are very strong, and will be very challenging. The short-term horizon is we want to move to 1.2 million cars by 2025, 50% of those to be BEV, and all of the BEVs will actually be sold online. And I'll come back to that later, because that is one of the big things that has a knock-on effect with how we'll distribute cars. To continue to make very strong margins in the premium sort of segment and above. Also to reduce total CO2 by 40% by 2025 and to be carbon neutral by 2040. And really a big focus on having in-house developed software. I think we all realize now that the software part of the car is the new critical distinction and really the competitive element of all of our brands now. So I think that there's a big challenge there. That's significant growth in a short term. And when I flip that to 2030 to turn fully electric, that's a huge challenge. So if I move on to the next phase, these two things really are the things that start to impact the distribution networks moving forward. So in terms of being a front runner in commercial transformation, I know lots of brands have been playing with online sales, but if you think about what I've just said, 50% of our volume will be BEVs by 2025, and all of those will be sold online. And the idea is they will be sold towards direct consumer business as well. So the relationship with the retailers will change. There's still a role for our retailers, but actually the connection with the customer and the supply chain will be much more direct, which I will elaborate on further. You see something there called Care by Volvo. We've already started in 5 markets in Europe trialing this. So selling directly to the customers. This is via a sort of subscription scheme online, but we'll go to cash sales and all sales types online by 2025. And then the electrification strategy. Like I said, we've come in late, but in the second half of this year, we will sell 40% of our total retail sales as some form of recharge, either a full BEV or a plug-in hybrid. On top of that, I'll mention it on my next slide, we've also got our sister brands. So I'll move on to that when it comes to transformation of distribution. So you can see on the right-hand side, Polestar and Lynk & Co. So new brands, entrance into the market. I think the Polestar brand's quite exciting. The write-ups for that brand are incredible. The quality and the driving performance from the media seems to be very well received. And effectively, it's going to be a performance EV. And Lynk & Co is another brand which is actually going to be a very, let's say, they're calling it a youthful brand because they're going to sell it in a different way. They're going to have what they call sort of pop-up stores and lounges that people go into to buy the car, not a traditional dealership network. But when it comes to Volvo cars, again, I think the key point there is we're trialing and evolving the traditional car sales business. And fundamentally, the online sales part in the middle is the part that is the most important for vehicle distribution. So what does it mean in terms of vehicle distribution? Electric vehicles, big challenge. We also know we still have a global footprint. We'll still be building cars in certain regions and moving them by vessel to other regions. So our ability to keep the car in the right condition throughout the supply chain with our partners and yourselves is really crucial. Then when it comes to the consumer offers, you'll see a number of icons there. I think the redesign of our networks is going to be critical. We'll be selling these cars from stock in the future, the online sales that are direct to consumer, which means that the planning and the placement of central compounds with the ability to be cost efficient, have very sharp lead times to the end customer, but also in terms of sustainability is really important. So if we're going to have some sort of central compound hub, in terms of the vehicle distribution network, we need the approach to those compounds in an ideal world to be on the most optimized, intermodal, sustainable solution, whether that's electrified trains, whether that's utilizing deep and short seat to the maximum, and whether in the future we can start to scale up and integrate electric trucks on the closed short loops that we'll need for our fast delivery from the final compound. So yeah, this is going to be very difficult. The service levels and the expectations from the consumer is going to be very high. And when I go to my final slides, you'll see I've been very fast and high level. You'll see the icon at the top talking about delivery. So our CEO has given us a challenge. I know Chris Godfrey's in the room and this is giving him nightmares, but we're talking about instant delivery. So the really high ambition is that from the point the customer presses the button online to buy the car, the whole process works to the point that the car will be with that customer within 10 to 15 working days. So if you put it in the context of today and the long pipelines we have, a build to order car, in the context of waiting for production to the end customer, you can talk 3, 4, 5 months, depending on which car it is and which plant it's coming from. Even the Care by Volvo model that we have now, actually all the processes to credit check the consumer, do the financial transaction, then release the car, then deliver it to the retailer, then get it ready for sale, then to go to the customer, that's taking around 45 days now on average. So if we want to really streamline this process to 15 days or 20 days, whatever number we end up on, the challenge for the supply chain ultimately is that we need to bring a lot of these things upstream. So there's the sort of retail processes today that happen outside of the company, which will happen within our ownership. So vehicle registration, PDI, PDS, ready for sale, credit checks, central stock owned by our company in optimum locations. Really optimized locations for the central compounds, so the deliveries can be done in that speed. It's a huge transformation. I mean, to do this as a trial for certain sales channels is one thing. To scale this up so it's the largest part of your business is another. So I think moving to this new distribution model and redesigning those networks, our reliance on working with key partners, logistics providers, ports, compound operators, service providers for car sales preparation is going to be huge. And then on top of that, we've got the network electrification readiness. So I think that also goes in terms of making sure the cars are charged, managed in the compounds to the point that they're able to be sold, but also the sustainability angle and actually having not just selling BEVs, but actually having a sustainable transport network and supply chain is going to be a huge challenge for us. So I've gone very fast there, and I think I've very oversimplified a significant change that's going to happen in the coming years. So we recognize that Volvo is still not a huge volume player, but I think very fast we're going to convert our business into being something very different to most of the brands, even if most companies are going in this direction. So I think my request to conclude to you all in the room is I'd like us, the OEMs, to share experience. I think I'd like us to collaborate. In terms of the logistics providers and partners, I also think this is a good chance for you to test scalability with Volvo Cars, who will go fast on this, as a precursor probably for the big volume players catching up in the future. So I would hope that you all see this as an opportunity to work with us and trial this new direct-to-consumer online electrified future in a fast way. So that really is my presentation. I think I've caught up a lot of time. I'll be very honest, I did have a lot more detail on my slides, but it was washed by communications in the last few days, and I was told very clearly I was sharing too much direct sensitive information that hasn't been publicly declared yet. So typical operations person, but I hope the message is clear, and I hope the concept is obvious that this is something very different. And Chris, who's obviously in the room, who's our global head of outbound logistics, and myself have been involved in the industry for a long time. And I think we both see this speed of change and this flip of the business model in such a short time is probably the biggest challenge of our career. We're quite excited by it, but we also recognize it's going to be very difficult to do in a short space of time to really convert more or less the whole business model to a new way of working. So that's my speech. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any from the room.
No. Martin, thank you very much. And you probably have no concept of how that came over, but actually the technical stuff worked very well. So yeah, great.
I'm worried about that.
But let's really test it now and see if we can take questions from the floor as well. So does anybody have any questions for Martin? Or maybe you get off lightly, or maybe they tackle Chris over coffee.
Good.
No? Well, I have to say, not only was that excellent, Martin, but you've actually got us exactly back on time. So thank you very much indeed for that. I think there are no questions in the room. So we'll let you go. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you face to face sometime soon.
Yes, I'll get my suit out of the cupboard.
Great. So we're just before we break. I was asked to say something about this. Thank you, all of you who've wished me well on my retirement, but actually that's not the plan. I'm not quite leaving yet. We are, I'm sure most of you have seen this, we are hiring somebody else to join the team, initially as a deputy, because we need some extra resource in the team in the short term. That's the urgency. I do plan to step down in about 4 years' time, so hopefully then we can have some seamless transition. If you either are interested or know somebody who you think might be suitable, somewhere in the room is Benedict, I hope. Possibly not. Okay. He was still in the bar when I went to bed at 3 o'clock this morning. Okay. Somewhere is supposed to be Benedict. If anybody's interested, let me know and I'll introduce you to him when he appears. So on that note, we will take a break for coffee. We'll be back in here at 11:20. So when you hear the bell, please come back in. Thank you very much.